People sometimes ask me how I learned to think the way I do. They imagine there must be a shortcut behind it, some hidden trick, some rare kind of intelligence that only a few people are born with. But the honest answer usually disappoints them. I don't believe I'm unusually smart. What I learned over time is something far more ordinary, and at the same time far more powerful. Most people don't actually think. They repeat. They memorize. They accept. And then they mistake that for understanding. That difference between accepting and thinking changes everything. I didn't discover this in a classroom or a laboratory. It started when I was a child, long before I knew it mattered. My father used to take me on walks, slow walks with no purpose other than paying attention. We would walk through nature, and he would point at things, birds, plants, small details most people ignore. One day he pointed at a bird and told me its name in several languages. Then he stopped and said something that stayed with me forever. He said, "Now you know what people call this bird, but you don't actually know the bird." At first, that sounded strange. Knowing the name felt like knowing the thing. But then he showed me how the bird behaved. He explained why it kept pecking at its feathers, how tiny parasites lived there, how the bird spent much of its life just staying clean to survive. Suddenly, the bird wasn't a word anymore. It was a system, a process, a living solution to a problem. That moment taught me a lesson most education systems never teach. Names feel like knowledge, but they're often a substitute for it. Labels give us comfort without understanding. As I grew older and entered formal education, I saw this pattern everywhere. Students were rewarded for repeating definitions, not for asking whether those definitions described anything real. Exams tested memory, not thinking. And people learned very quickly that sounding confident mattered more than being curious. Later, when I studied physics at advanced levels, surrounded by brilliant students, I noticed something unsettling. Professors would write complex equations on the board. "Let me," and everyone would copy them down carefully. At the end of the lecture, someone would ask a question, and the answer would come in the form of more symbols, more abstraction. Everyone would nod, satisfied. But I would sit there feeling uneasy. Not because the math was difficult, but because no one seemed to ask the obvious question: what is actually happening? What does this describe in the real world? If I could watch this process unfold in front of me, what would I see? Most people never ask that. They assume understanding comes from complexity. If something sounds advanced enough, they assume it must be true, and that they must understand it. That habit doesn't stop at school. I saw it again later when I taught physics to students who were incredibly hardworking and disciplined. They could memorize entire textbooks word for word. But when I asked them simple, practical questions, not theoretical puzzles, just real-world scenarios, they struggled. They knew what the book said would happen, but they had never thought about why. That's when something became clear to me. Thinking isn't something you're born with. It's a habit you build. And most people never build it because they're never asked to. The first habit I learned, without realizing it at the time, was to translate everything into something I could imagine clearly, not vaguely. Clearly. If I couldn't picture it, I didn't allow myself to feel satisfied. When I learned about atoms, I didn't stop at the sentence. Atoms are the building blocks of matter. That sentence means nothing by itself. I imagined atoms moving, colliding, attracting, repelling. I asked myself what I would see if I were small enough to watch them. Would they move smoothly or jitter randomly? Would they clump together or push apart? Later, when I encountered equations, I treated them the same way. While others rushed through problem sets, I often spent a long time staring at a single equation. Not because I was slow, but because I refused to move on until I could translate the symbols into behavior. I wanted to know what was changing, what was causing the change, and why. Sometimes I invented strange mental experiments. I imagined shrinking down to the size of an electron, floating in space. If another charge came close, what would I feel? How would I know something had changed? What force would act on me, and in which direction? It might sound childish, but that's exactly why it works. Understanding doesn't live in symbols. Symbols are shortcuts. Real understanding lives in experience, even imagined experience. Most people skip this step. They memorize the abstraction first, formulas, terminology, theories, without ever connecting them to reality. The result is knowledge without roots. It feels impressive for a short time, but it doesn't last. That's why so much of what people learn disappears shortly after an exam. There was never real understanding holding it in place. The second habit I had to develop was learning to ask why, and not just once. Over and over, like a child. Children don't stop at the first explanation. They keep pushing until something actually makes sense or until the explanation falls apart. Adults lose this habit because they're afraid of looking ignorant. They nod instead of asking. They pretend instead of thinking. And once you do that, learning stops. I saw this clearly when students came to me confused about difficult subjects. Often, they could recite definitions perfectly, but when I asked them to explain the idea in their own words, without jargon, they couldn't. Not because the idea was impossible, but because they had never really thought about it. So I would take them backward, stripping away complexity until we reached something concrete and simple. From there, understanding could grow naturally, not as memorized knowledge, but as something real. This leads to one of the most important habits of all, not being afraid of not knowing. Most people treat ignorance as failure. They hide it. They cover it with fancy language. But pretending to know is far more dangerous than admitting confusion. The moment you admit you don't understand something, you give yourself permission to learn it. I spent my life around extremely intelligent people, many of them famous and respected. And I noticed something surprising. The ones who truly understood their work weren't the ones who sounded the most confident. They were the ones who were comfortable saying, I don't know yet, and then sitting with that discomfort until clarity arrived. I made a rule for myself. If I couldn't explain an idea simply to someone with no background, then I didn't really understand it. That rule kept me honest. It forced me to think instead of hiding behind complexity. Most people stop themselves before they even begin. They decide something is too complicated, too advanced, too far beyond them. But understanding isn't about being smart. It's about being patient, curious, and honest enough to keep thinking. And that's where real thinking begins. Over time, I realized that one of the biggest obstacles to thinking clearly isn't lack of intelligence. It's fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of asking a question that sounds too simple. Fear of admitting confusion in a room full of confident faces. That fear quietly shuts down curiosity. I saw this often in academic environments. Someone would give a highly technical talk filled with impressive language and complex ideas. Most people would sit silently, nodding along. Not because they understood everything, but because they didn't want to stand out. They didn't want to be the one who asked a basic question. Yet whenever I did ask, afterwards several people would come to me and admit they were confused too. The silence wasn't understanding. It was performance. That's when it became clear to me that much of what passes for expertise is simply familiarity with language. People learn which words to use, which phrases sound correct, and how to arrange them convincingly. But if you ask them to slow down and explain what's really happening in plain terms, the explanation often collapses. Complexity becomes a hiding place. So I trained myself to resist that. Whenever I encountered a new idea, I treated it with suspicion, not hostility, but curiosity. I asked myself whether I truly understood it or whether I was just recognizing familiar words. If it only lived in abstract language, I didn't trust it yet. Me? Another habit that helped was learning to sit comfortably with unanswered questions. Not rushing to fill the gap with assumptions or borrowed explanations. Just staying there, in the uncertainty. That space, uncomfortable as it is, turns out to be incredibly productive. It's where real insight forms. I also discovered something unexpected. Me. Thinking works best when it feels playful. When it's driven by curiosity rather than pressure. Some of my most meaningful insights didn't come from intense effort, but from relaxed exploration. When I stopped worrying about whether an idea was important and focused instead on whether it was interesting, my thinking became sharper. Curiosity has a strange effect. It removes fear. When you're genuinely curious, being wrong doesn't feel like failure. It feels like progress. Each mistake narrows the path toward understanding. This approach doesn't just apply to science. It applies to anything worth understanding. If you rely only on authority, you'll never really know what's true. If you memorize without questioning, your knowledge will always be fragile. But if you slow down, ask simple questions, and refuse to pretend, you build something far more durable. Thinking clearly isn't about impressing others. It's about being honest with yourself. It's about noticing when you're confused and caring enough to stay with the confusion until it turns in clarity. That habit alone separates real understanding from everything else. Real thinking is quiet. It doesn't rush to conclusions, and it doesn't try to impress. Most of the time, it feels slow and uncertain. That discomfort is not a flaw, It's a signal that you're actually thinking. We live in a world that rewards fast answers and confident opinions. But understanding doesn't grow that way. It grows when you're willing to pause and admit, honestly, I don't understand this yet. A simple rule helps keep thinking honest. If you can't explain an idea clearly, in plain language, then you don't fully understand it. Complexity should come from the subject itself, not from vague words or borrowed language. Clarity is the real test. This is why explaining ideas to others is so powerful. It reveals what you truly know and where your understanding breaks down. Those gaps aren't weaknesses. They show you exactly where to think more deeply. The habit that matters most is curiosity without fear. Not being afraid of uncertainty. Not pretending to know. Staying with a question long enough to see it clearly. Thinking isn't about sounding intelligent or reaching final answers. It's about asking better questions, again and again, until things begin to make sense. That's how real understanding develops, slowly, quietly and honestly.